and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author, but I also run the activities that our centre does. And today I am joined by a friend of the centre, who is also one of our tutors, but today she is here wearing her hat as an author. So hello, yes, virtual hat. Hello to Lucy Strange. Now, Lucy, perhaps you'd like to just tell us the headlines of who you are, and you can also hold up your book, because for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, we can do a kind of coordinated
Do a thing.
It's
Yeah.
a
Okay.
wonderful book cover. So do look it up if you're listening to this on the audio. But it's a book called The Island at the Edge of Night. So Lucy, how did you get into this business of writing fantasy?
Well, I don't think I'd pass the test of true fantasy, Julia, because I think because my stories are all set in the real world, but we have like elements of fantasy
That
in
is
them.
fantasy. I'm sorry to burst the
Is
bubble there. It is. Fantasy is a spectrum. So obviously,
it?
we can all say something with like spells and wizards and dragons,
Yeah.
but there is
Yeah.
a lot of books which have a fantastical element. Anything that
Yeah.
isn't absolutely real verges into fantasy.
Yeah. It is fantasy. Is it sort of the magical realism end of
Yeah,
fantasy-ish
yeah.
kind of, yeah, that kind of place. So I started writing. My books are primarily for younger readers, so they're sort of age 9 and up. My first book is this one, The Secret of Nightingale Wood, that came out in 2016, with a publisher called Chicken House in the UK, Scholastic in the US. Um, and I what I wanted to do is I wanted to create stories that kind of had a classic children's literature feeling to them, but that were much more kind of page turny and that bit more sort of suited to modern young readers. Um, and the fantastical element has just sort of found its way into every story that I write. And stories for me just don't, I suppose, don't feel magical enough or special enough without something kind of eerie and supernatural kind of simmering away somewhere or kind of seeping through somehow. So that's kind of how it's happened. There's a lot of gothic influence in my books as well. So I play with elements of the gothic and fantasy to varying degrees in the different stories. My most fantasy, I suppose, is this one, Sisters of the Lost Marsh, which came out a couple of years ago. Um, and in this one, it does feel more like a fantastical world, I think.
Yeah, I think if we go through our archive, I think we talked about that particular book then
Yeah.
at the time. Yeah. So all of us have like gateway drug authors to our addiction to reading. Did you have, that's probably a strange way of explaining it, but it does feel like you get hooked as a reader.
Yeah.
Um, did you have
Yeah.
any favorite authors as you were growing up? Or maybe people who have inspired you to make you want to do this now as a grown up?
I think, well, I was always a bookworm, and I think, I mean, I can remember various books that hooked me in. Um, and Actually, initially, audiobooks was something that really connected with me, and I think it's because I just used to listen to them over and over again.
Mm.
I just sort of absorbed, I assimilated them, and I think it's partly through that. So I had Alice in Wonderland. I used to listen to an audiobook. I had Jane Asher narrating that one, and The Secret Garden,
Oh, yeah.
which for me, probably Frances Hodgson Burnett, which for me probably is my touchstone children's literature that I think, um, and it's not fantasy, but there are definitely elements of the gothic. There are suggestions of supernatural about it, and nature is presented as magical in it as
Mm.
well, I think. So I think it yeah, I think there's a huge amount of influence from that story. In all my, I think if you cut my books open like cakes, I think you'd find the secret garden there somewhere in all of them.
That's actually, we probably should do an episode on Frances Hodgson Burnett, because she was my favorite author as a little girl. And you're right, it's that feeling that the world is magical, even though it's ordinary. So there is a secret
Mm.
garden hidden behind the wall to which you find the key. And
Yeah.
there is diamond mines in the case of Little Princess, but also
Yeah.
somebody
Yeah.
climbs in and decorates your bedroom with these wonderful sort of Indian tapestries whilst you're the Cinderella working in your old school. It's got this blend of,
Yeah.
well, this could be played absolutely straightforward. This happens in real life, but there's
Mm.
always this air of fairy tale to it. So
Yeah.
that's where you're coming from in a way. It's
Yeah.
that natural magic to
Yeah. I think so. Also, I think um oh, so the Princess and the Goblin,
oh
George
yes.
MacDonald, which is I think which is probably the most I did read Narnia as well. I did love Narnia, but for me there was something about the Princess and the Goblin, and the whole Christian analogy totally passed me by, like
Mm.
totally passed me by. But I remember really feeling the significance. So there's a silver thread that guides them through the story and takes them out of the darkest places. And there's this extraordinary scene with this sort of, I suppose, like the archetype of a mentor slash wizardy kind of character who's her great great grandmother, who possibly does or possibly doesn't exist up in the turret of this castle. And there's this deep bath that she puts her into, and she sort of sinks into this, like she's kind of floating in sort of the night sky. And it's just something of that has stayed with me all my life. And for me, I think that was quite a sort of seminal fantasy moment for me as well with literature.
It's
But
funny.
it's hard to pin them down, isn't it?
Did you ever read any Charles Kingsley? Because one of the books I was very influenced by was The Water Babies, which I realize now was in a abbreviated version. I think they must have cut out quite a lot of the
Oh yeah,
moralizing, but
there's a lot of it that has not dated well. Yeah.
yeah, but it had
Yeah.
some wonderful pictures with it by Mabel Lucy Atwell, I think her name was. And again, it has this heavy-handed sort of Christian moralism going on in it, but that totally didn't matter. It was the
Yeah.
idea that this boy could transform himself into a water baby and live under the water. I was taking
Yeah.
it like literally, it's not baptism or anything. He literally goes and lives under the water like some kind.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Actually, it's very funny that you should mention that. And I should just say for anyone watching that we didn't actually plan this. But I also write these little books for Barrington Stoke, these short dyslexia friendly children's books. And in June, I've got a book coming out, Julia,
Oh, excitement.
called called The River Spirit, which is inspired by Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, and it's about a chimney. It's based on also the true story of a chimney sweep in Victorian England, George Brewster. But so we've got Tom as the little boy, the chimney sweep in it, and we've got, instead of Ellie, the girl he meets, we've got Elle, who's like a water nymph, water spirit, and it's a sad story told, I hope, in a magical and hopeful way.
But
But yeah.
do you have now? This is what I really remember from that book: Mrs. Do as you would be done by, and Mrs. Done by as you did.
I don't. I don't have those characters.
But
And
what
isn't it?
wonderful names!
They are wonderful. And but very my little boy's listening to the audiobook of Magic Faraway Tree at the moment. And Enid Blyton owed a lot to those sorts of names. We get those sorts of names in Enid Blyton, don't we? And
Yeah, you
those
do.
kind of stories. Those sort of those characters who are there to teach us a lesson. There's a fair bit of that. But they're not in my book.
No, no, no. I mean, we're talking Victorians had their own
Yeah.
market, their own understanding of how you write for children. They did them, and we
Mm.
do us. So, would you just tell us briefly how you got your first deal? And then I was going to suggest that because you've got, is it 6 books now, 6 big novels, something like that.
Oh,
I'm gonna,
five big ones.
5 big ones. I'm going
Five
to
big ones,
ask
two
you
little
to
ones.
identify, without explaining too much. I'm going to ask you a question about the book before we get on to the island, your previous ones about there. So quite mysterious for people. I'm going to ask you questions about the books and your relationship with them. So it will make
Mhm.
people want to go away and read them. So,
Okay, sounds
okay.
good to me.
Yeah. Otherwise, if we tell them too much, they'll think, oh no, I know what's going on in that. And then, but now we can do this little teaser. So
Okay.
how did you get that first deal? You're obviously not that older person. You're a young mother. Uh,
Young mother. I'm actually quite an old mother. I'm quite a late. I left it a bit late, but I yeah. So actually, I wasn't a very conventional way in, and I don't know if that is or isn't encouraging for other people, but I would hope that it is. So I was teaching. I was a full-time English teacher when I started writing, and I started playing with this idea. I think because I'd been a bookworm all my life because I'd studied English and I was teaching literature. I think I had very sort of high standards of what good writing was. And so when I dabbled over the years, I was never pleased with it. I always felt it was awful. And it wasn't really and my sort of my late 30s that I started thinking maybe I can have another go at this. Maybe I feel a bit more confident about what I want to do and how I want to write. And so I was teaching. I started writing, and what I did is I entered some chapters of writing into a competition at a literature festival, and it was through a literary agent judged the competition, Luigi Bonomi, who's now my agent. He helped me to develop the first full manuscript of The Secret of Nightingale Wood, which was at the time called Moth and the Nightingale, and he sold it to Chicken House. And Chicken House, I think, just bought that, and then they bought another two, and then they bought another two, and I've just signed with them for another three. So it just sort of happened. And I never went through that process of submitting manuscripts to agents, because it happened in this slightly different way. But I do recommend competitions. There are some wonderful competitions, including the Oxford Centre for Fantasy's own competition with Pushkin. But there are some other lovely competitions. Chicken House runs a competition with the Times, and it can just be a way to get your work in front of the right people, I think. And I think it can be a different way in and different path, rather than what I know can be a really disheartening process.
but you also have some kind of actor training, don't you? Because you do your own audiobooks and others.
Yeah, I do. So after university, I went to Oxford School of Drama, and on their postgraduate course, I was there for a year, and I worked as an actor. I say worked. I
Looked for
didn't
work.
work much. I looked for work as an actor. I did a few bits and bobs, and then pretty soon after that, I did my English teacher training and went and became an English teacher. But it turns out that it was all worthwhile, because life takes us on these wiggly paths,
Yeah.
doesn't it? And nothing's ever wasted. So well, for a start, actually, I think the acting helps with my writing, because a lot of the time I write in the first person, and I get very, very immersed when I'm writing, and I'm always testing things on myself and thinking about how it feels physically and what's going on in my body and all of this sort of thing. And making myself cry and so on, which is embarrassing when writing on trains, but never mind. And pulling all the faces. But yeah, so after the first book was published, Nightingale Wood, they said, "Oh, we've sold the audiobook rights. Do you want to have any involvement in who's reading it?" And I said, "Well, could I read it, please?" And they said, "Oh, not sure. Writers often aren't the best people," which is fair enough, to narrate their own books. But they let me audition, so I had to record an audition tape of me reading a chapter of the book, and then I was allowed to do it, which is really nice. And so I do the audiobooks for my own books, and I do the US audiobooks as well, which are always slightly different, but we record them separately, which is interesting. And they've done quite well in the US. I don't know why. I think it's the British accent. Who can say? But they've done quite well in the US. So I was just shortlisted for the audio of this year's audio awards in LA, a lot alongside Michelle Obama and Patrick Stewart.
Oh no.
Which was awesome. I didn't win, but neither did Patrick Stewart or Michelle Obama, so I'm in good company. But yeah, and on the strength of that, I've been asked to start narrating other people's audiobooks. So I've just narrated Anne Howard Walker's brilliant dark dystopian fantasy, Once Upon a Fever, which is really good. Highly recommended.
An interesting sideline. I didn't know about the Michelle Obama near miss. So we're now going to do our quick fire round, where I'm going to ask you some questions. I want you to answer with the title of a book.
Ooh.
Okay, so the first is, which book was most difficult to write?
Mm. The latest one.
So
It's been a long time coming.
The Island at the Edge of Night
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
okay. Which
Yeah.
of your books is the most quirky?
Quirky. Quirky. I'm going to go with this is the most quirky, largely because of the narrative voice in it is very different and has the whole book has a slightly different feeling to it.
So
Yeah.
that's Sisters of the Lost Marsh
Sisters of the Lost Marsh.
is the most quirky.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last one I'm going to ask is, which book is most like you?
Mm, which book is most like me? Okay, probably my first one, The Secret of Nightingale Wood, is probably, I think for a lot of people find that, I mean, there's nothing in it that's happened to me. It's
No,
not like that, but there was a lot of my heart in that first one. And I wrote it when I was living abroad. So when I was teaching in the Middle East, and I was really, really homesick. And I sort of think that's possibly partly part of the reason why I started writing, is sort of a way of dealing with all of that. And so although it's not about homesickness, but there's a real sense of kind of loss and nostalgia that's in there. So it does feel like one of my most personal ones.
so I hope that's tempting people to go in and look at them through those lenses. So tell us about your latest book, The Island at the Edge of Night.
Okay, so yeah, so this is just it's fresh out, it's virtually still warm from the printing press. um the Island at the Edge of Night, so it is a sort of gothic mystery story set on a remote Scottish island. It's a fictitious Scottish island but inspired by real places, which we can talk about a bit later on. But our main character is called Faye Fitzgerald, and she is sent away to a sinister boarding school, the remote Scottish island. And she is told that, along with the other children, there are only about 6 other children there at the school. She is told that she has been sent to this school because she has done something. But the problem is she can't remember what it is she's supposed to have done, because she has blanked out everything that happened on the terrible night of the storm.
So the wicked thing she has done has sort of disappeared into the past. So I read it very with great enjoyment. It's a wonderful book, but I was also very struck by how it feels like being in a really powerful nightmare. It's a nightmarish world where you are
Yeah.
powerless. Things happen to you and around you. And I suppose for Faye, our main character, though, of course, there is a moment where it shifts, where she's able to take more agency as sort of like but certainly for the first chapters,
Mm,
um, it's that feeling which lots of us have as children, of course, and in nightmares, where we're on this, it's like we're going down a ski run and there's no stop. We're just
yeah.
going and we're being forced in a direction. So when you're writing those kind of passages, and do you find yourself caught up in the book and actually have to surface from time to time and say, actually, real life is still going on outside the door. I'm not stuck in this nightmare, really.
A bit, yeah. I do think interesting that you talk about powerlessness, because I think to some degree it is there in all my stories for young readers. It's something that I think is particularly pertinent to the age group that I write for. I think when you're that age, when you're sort of, well, 11, 10, 11, 12, and you're a fully formed person, really, and you're kind of straining towards having this autonomy and this control over your own life, and yet grown-ups are still completely in charge of you. And I remember that feeling of powerlessness so powerfully, so vividly, and that comes through in the stories, definitely. um and the nightmarish feeling is absolutely right. And I hadn't actually chosen that word for it, but it's perfect. And that is exactly what Faye is experiencing in the early chapters of this story. This feeling of just being carried along in this sort of hellish dark wave into this unknown world. And coupled with the feeling that somehow it's all her fault, I
Yeah.
think. And that's part of it as well. And it is quite intense. It's to write. It is quite intense, right? And that's part of. In fact, there's a very personal reason why the story took me a long time. And that's because my dear dad died suddenly soon after I started writing it. And there's a father-daughter relationship that's at the heart of the story. And that, I think, coupled with what you're talking about, the intensity, the intense atmosphere of the story, I think made it very hard to write for quite a long time. I found it very hard to work on this story, and that's
Yeah.
why it ended up taking so long, I think. Um, but I also think that through working through Faye's story and finding her hope and her happiness at the end, I believe all children's books should have hope and happiness in them in their conclusions. That, you know, it was a wonderful process to do. But in those early stages, I don't know if this is a common thing. I should probably talk to a therapist about it at some point. But I wanted to write comedy. I didn't want to write something dark and heavy. I wanted to write comedy. I wanted to write something really light and silly, which is what I ended up doing, and then coming back to this story when I felt ready.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there is a really important function of writing that many of our listeners probably already know or will discover, which is it does help you put a frame around an experience. You might not be writing directly at the experience, loss, grief, breakdown of a relationship, but you can kind of transplant it somewhere else and write about it and exorcise some of the emotions. You don't get rid of them because those emotions are integral to your life and your character, but it does help deal with it in a way and process it.
Yes, just to sort of to explore it in quite a gentle, slightly detached way, I think.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's very British.
Yeah. No, I think that probably most people all around the world, I think, would find that helpful. So you're notable in your style to have a very, I'm sure it's a wonderful audio book. I haven't actually listened to, is it out already as an audio book?
I don't think the audiobook is out yet for this one.
But
Soon.
it begs to be read aloud. So would you like to read us a little short passage, and then perhaps we could talk about your sort of more poetic approach to writing and how it feels to you when you're actually sitting there at your computer, how you sound out the words to yourself.
Yeah, lovely. Yeah, I'll read you the prologue. Not all stories have a prologue. Not all stories need a prologue, but this one needed one. So here we go. The house was all in darkness, and the storm was still raging outside, just as it had been when I'd gone to bed a few hours before. But I wasn't in my bed now. I was standing at the top of the stairs with no memory of how I had got there. Had I been sleepwalking? I was in my nightdress, and the floorboards were as cold as glass beneath my bare feet. Aunt Christina? Father? I called, but there was no reply. Lightning flashed, sudden and blinding white. I gripped the banister to steady myself, to steady my heart. Thunder crashed above the city, and rain hammered on the roof and windows, pounding a pulse in my brain, frightened and furious. Was it the storm that had woken me? Or was it something else? I made my way down the stairs and out of the kitchen door into the walled garden. I remember the wind and rain striking hard, making me gasp. Fallen leaves slimed wet between my toes, and my nightdress clung heavy and cold. I remember going past Father's collection of plants, all battered and cowering. I remember crawling through the hole in the broken fence into the graveyard. I remember seeing the old yew tree, a ragged silhouette against the storm-lit sky. And then the memory shatters like a mirror. All I have are a handful of splinters, flashes of that night that come and go like lightning. A metal blade, gleaming wet. A hacking, splitting sound that makes me go cold inside. A scream so piercing it still buzzes deep in my bones. After that night, there was nothing. Just weeks of stifling dark, the city rain relentless on my bedroom window. Day-long dreams left me shaking with terror, those dark shards of memory, and the faintest echo of a voice murmuring in horror, "What have you done, Faye? Oh, what have you done, you wicked child?" There we go. It's not all as dark as that, I'll just say.
But it does sum up the nightmarish quality, because that is a kind of nightmare that, yeah. So I'm listening to that. For people who are interested in their own writing, which many of the listeners are, is I noticed that this is getting quite granular here, but when you're evoking little moments or little passages, you're using the same consonant sounds.
Yeah.
There's a thing about the pulse and pounding pulse.
Pounding a pulse. Yeah.
Yes, and there was another collection of
Frightened
essays.
and furious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is more of a poetic technique. So if people are looking to um, raise up their writing to a new level and find a more sort of beautiful treatment of language, have you got any tips how you might want to go about that? What do you do?
I think it's hearing it. I think it's hearing it. And when I do a lot of talks in schools, and I talk about why audiobooks are so wonderful, and because we get to hear the sounds of the words and the rhythms and the patterns and the sentences, because authors sculpt them. We craft our sentences,
Yeah.
don't we? And sometimes it's only really through hearing it aloud that you can hear that crafting and that sculpting. And I think I hear my sentences aloud as I write. I hear it in my head, and I quite often I will say things out loud as I'm writing as well. But I do think it's important to get a balance, because I think I can get a bit indulgent with my with my purple prose at times, and I think it needs to have its moments. And I think when as I write more and as I get more experienced as a writer, I think I'm aware of where there's room, where there's breathing space in the story for us to have that little bit of kind of lyrical building of atmosphere, and then where actually we need to be much more much more sharp, and just allow the plot to move on without being encumbered by that kind of language play. So it is about balance as well, I think.
Yeah, I think it's like calorie intake. You have to sort of go for fine amounts, but not like 5,000 calorie intake on a page. It's got to be much
Yeah.
more diet.
Yeah. On my first book, my editor said, "You're allowed one simile on this page, Lucy. One simile." I was like, "Okay."
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to we can all be indulgent as writers, but and I don't know, sometimes that's part of, if that's what it takes to get you through a first draft, you just to enjoy the language of it, then it has its role to play in that. But I think obviously it's very important we think about it from the reader's perspective and what the reader needs at any given point in the story.
So Lucy, you also are one of our tutors on our courses that we run. And we've been doing those for a few years now, which is how I've got to know you really. And I always learn something from you and the other tutors every time, even though I hear roughly the same presentation, it's always something which I take away. And one of my favorite take homes that you've said over the years is how you create a mood board. And then that same mood board has been used to influence your covers, which, if people look them up, they're beautifully illustrated covers with a definite mood about them. So, what is a mood board, and how does that process go that it ends up being reflected in your cover?
So it's essentially, it's just a collage. I think I believe very much that we need to take time. We need to take time to allow stories to be ready to be written. I think one of the mistakes that we make all too often is to rush into the writing before the story is ready, before we've got enough ingredients in it, before it's it needs to stand on its own 2 feet, doesn't it? It needs to have that sense of like an energy of its own. And so we do our research, and we do our reading, and we do our daydreaming, and we do our planning and playing with ideas and some character work and all of that sort of thing. And as part of that process, I gather a lot of images. And I suppose I'm quite a visual person, but I find that it sort of nourishes my imagination for the world that I'm creating, and the story that I'm working on. So I guess a lot of photography, but particularly artwork, particularly paintings. And I find that or generally, because I base my settings on real world places, the artwork is very often of those real world settings, real world places. And I find that having those places already interpreted by an artist, having that layer of artistic interpretation there, gives me something. It feeds into the creative process in a really exciting way. So what I have is lots of images from research, these artworks and various things, and I create a collage, and I call it my mood board. And with it, I'm trying to evoke not just physical elements of the story, but also a sense of tone and atmosphere and what it feels like to be in the world of my story. It makes me think about what I want the icons of my story to be, what I want those key elements of the story to be, that will stay with the reader. It makes me think about the aesthetic of the story, if particular colors are going to be important. Um, and then what happened when and it changes, it develops as I'm working on the book. And then in one of the later stages, I will send my mood boards to my publisher, and they pass it on to the designer and the artist who are working on the book cover. And it sometimes, but not always, seems to have some influence, sometimes more literally. So in my Gothic ghost story, The Ghost of Goswater, we have this dark Gothic mansion here, and that is very, very much an interpretation of the Gothic mansion that I had on my mood board. So it has that very practical purpose as well, that it feeds into the design of the book. And the colours, I need, so this the artist for this was Helen Crawford White. She's a fantastic British artist. And this one is an artist I hadn't worked before, Katie Hickey, and she's wonderful.
So as some people are listening to this, Lucy's
Oh
holding
yes,
up
sorry.
the latest book, The
Holding
Island
up.
at the Edge of the Night, which is a mixture of blue, a sort of
Yeah,
burnt
purple,
orange, kind of
yeah,
red sunset colors, really.
and a sort of a pinky foil
Yeah.
on it as well. Yeah, and that the colours very much came through from my mood board for that one. So it has that practical purpose too. And then when I'm working on the story and editing, and I have my mood board as like my wallpaper on my laptop, or I'll have it beside me, and I just find it helps me to be consistent, I suppose. I think, as writers, and particularly before writers get published, the time we have to write is often very limited, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I often feel like I spend, if I've got only a couple of hours in a day to actually write, I feel like I spend a lot of that time just getting in the zone, like just just getting there, getting to the right point. And I do find things like mood boards and mood music really just help me with that process, help me to get into exactly the right zone, the right tone with my writing.
That's brilliant. So thank you for that. So I always sort of conclude with guests with asking them something about where in all the fantasy world is the best place for something. And as we've got The Island at the Edge of Night, which, to be honest, is a kind of mixed bag of a place to go. It might be quite nice by the end of the novel, but certainly not at the beginning. But where would you say is the best island in all the fantasy worlds to go?
Oh, that's a good. Actually, I hadn't mentioned the Scottish islands that inspired this book, but it is largely inspired by the Hebrides Islands, the setting for this one, Isle of
Yes.
Skye, St Kilda, and so on. Um, I think islands themselves are so magical as settings. I think because they can be their own little world, and they can have the I suppose they can have the darkness and the light. They can have all sorts of secrets, can't they? Islands. Um, so other fantasy island. I suppose Neverland. Neverland springs to
Oh,
mind
yes,
as
that's
being
true.
its own magical fantasy island that has both heroic and villainous and magical and so on. What would you pick? What would be one of your fantasy islands?
Well, I've thought of two. So I was thinking about remembering the maps of Earthsea, which was the Ursula Le Guin story where they're sailing between
Mm,
islands. But I can't remember. I'm just thinking I can't remember much about the actual islands. I just remember the map. So
mm,
probably not that one then. But then the Dawn Treader, the Voyage of the
yeah.
Dawn Treader, which has just one for each island is different. Each has an adventure. It's very like Odysseus. I'm sure that was in the back of C.S. Lewis's mind. Um, that idea of each island moves you further along in the plot and the story, and is
Mm,
distinctly flavored. So maybe I would say an island in that ocean that is the Voyage of the Dawn Treader would be my favorite.
yeah. There's a lovely, lovely book that came out by Nicholas Bowling a few years ago, Song of the Far Isles, which is also inspired by the Scottish Western Isles. But it's fantasy, and it's the most magical story, in which music is like everyone has sort of a musical instrument that's connected to their soul, and it's kind of music that keeps these islands alive. And there's kind of pirates and stuff as well, and that's a wonderful one. Song of the Far Isles.
And then Treasure Island, of course, but Treasure
Yeah.
Island, I suppose, is purported in the real world, isn't it? So sort of ish.
Yeah, Robinson Crusoe is not terribly magical.
No. Though Gulliver's Travels also has islands, which is like the granddaddy of the fantasy voyage story.
Yeah.
Do you have a fantasy tip to share with us? This could be something you've read or watched recently, or just a tip for anybody who's writing.
I think a fantasy tip. Well, in terms of a book, I would recommend the book I just mentioned, Once Upon a Fever, Howard Walker, and there's a sequel's just come out, A Cure Ever After. In terms of a writing tip, I think it would be almost like an anti-fantasy sort of a writing tip in a way, in that although you might be creating a fantastical world with fantastical characters and magical things going on, that it needs to feel convincing. It needs to feel completely real, and your reader needs to be able to connect with it. And so I think that would probably be my tip, and finding ways to make it feel real, perhaps through characterization and making sure your characters are really three-dimensional, their responses are convincing, and then everything feels very kind of visceral and powerfully, emotionally and physically, it feels convincing. And the settings, I think settings can help with that as well. Perhaps using real world settings and allowing them to become your fantasy settings and give it that authenticity that I think we need in order to help readers to connect with a fantasy world.
Thank you, Lucy. That's a whole bundle of tips there, which I'm sure people will find very helpful. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.